Hello and welcome back, adventurers. This is Captain TTRPG, and today we're talking about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Hello and welcome back, adventurers. Today I want to talk about a slightly controversial topic, as we do once in a while here. And by the way, thank you for all the comments. Yes, I know how wrong I am, and I love to hear every time just how bad my takes are. This one comes from the way that DnD5E has kind of set up its community and how that relates to Pathfinder2e. We're going to consider one of the biggest problems DnD5E has, which is its Spellcaster Problem. I'll break down what I mean by this and give my thoughts on what the problem is, or even if one exists at all. So what do I mean by a Spellcaster Problem and whether or not it exists in Pathfinder2e? Well, first we have to talk about spellcasters in DnD5e. Let's go back to the 2014 version, which is what most people still know and play, to be honest, to really get a good understanding. In 5e, there's generally accepted that the system has a martial caster divide. This is to say that spellcasters are generally much more powerful in the system than martial characters are. Spellcasters can not only control the battlefield and support their allies in ways that martials simply can't, but they also have greater survivability in many cases, thanks to the way that multi-classing works and certain spells like the shield spell and mirror image work. They are greater multi-target or AoE damage dealers, and in some ways they can even deal more damage with single target than a lot of martial builds can because of things like the Bladesinger Wizard or the Hexblade Warlock, or even honestly the Eldritch Blast Warlock in some cases. They just eat martial's lunch while still mastering their own strengths. Now, this doesn't stop people from playing martial characters in the system, but those playing martial characters honestly often end up overshadowed. Beyond being far too well-rounded, the spells available to spellcasters are extremely potent in the system. Well, at least the best of the best spells are, not every spell, mind you. I already mentioned a few of the defensive spells of great strength, but then you have strong control spells like Hypnotic Pattern, and Banishment that can just remove creatures from encounters right away. There are spells like Wall of Force and Force Cage that can allow default killing of a lot of creatures, which means killing a creature in ways that they have no way to retaliate against, so it's basically just over as soon as it starts. There are also huge buff spells, even things like Bless, which is just a first level spell, or Hero's Feast, that just give incredible boosts to the party, or nearly the whole party. And of course, there are your straightforward blast spells like Fireball, Chain Lightning, and even the single target magic missile that can really be game changers in certain situations. And those are just the combat spells. Out of combat, there are a slew of powerful spells for getting important information, aiding in NPC interaction, spying on enemies, and even moving about the world. And with all of that power, what do martials get? Mostly a few better ways to hit something a little bit harder in combat. Okay, that's a little churlish. They often do get other options to manage single target control or moving enemies, things like that, just not on the same scale that spellcasters do. So to boil it down, the casters in DnD5e were given all the toys to play with, where martials were mostly just have to sit back and be jealous? I don't know. I will admit that the gap seems to be smaller in the 2024 edition of D&D with the update, but it hasn't disappeared and, well, most people still aren't playing it. Well, that sounds pretty challenging. Does the same thing exist in Pathfinder2e? I'll simply put, no. In fact, anecdotally, in games that I've run and played in, and even seen the discussions in forums, we see far more martial characters in play in Pathfinder 2nd Edition than we do casters. So does that mean that Pathfinder 2nd Edition has the opposite problem of D&D5e? That it's a caster-martial divide of the other style of impact? It's this question that really kind of goaded me into creating this video in the first place, if I'm being honest with you. But after really diving in, looking at all that's available, looking at how my team plays, I actually don't think the opposite problem exists either. In fact, I think what we're looking at is a much more even system. But if that's the case, why do we see so many people playing martials in Pathfinder 2nd Edition compared to how many spellcasters we see played? I actually think there are 5 main reasons we see that, and I don't think any of them are really necessarily a huge problem, if they're a problem at all. So what are those 5 potential reasons for people playing more martials than we do see spellcasters? Again, at least anecdotally, and what I see people discussing on forums. Well, the first is that there's a massive influx of people from D&D5e into the Pathfinder2e system, at least thanks to the OGL scandal. That system where martials really didn't have the right power at all, now these people see that martials are quite strong in Pathfinder, and they're incentivized to try them out because they haven't felt like they could play them for years. Second, casters in Pathfinder 2e aren't amazing at everything. Specifically, they aren't amazing at single target damage, but they're good at a lot of things still. And to be honest, you can be good at single target damage, as one of my players has shown many times. Third, the spells in Pathfinder 2e aren't straight up broken. They aren't just all powerful beyond their means. They are strong, and they do a good job of what they do, but they don't just straight up win combats for you outright. Fourth, partial caster options are available to martial characters through archetypes. So even if you want some of that spellcasting, you don't have to be a full caster to do it. Although you won't be as good at it, you still get some strong casting. And finally, fifth, this is a small one, and I don't know that it plays big in here, but I wanted to bring it up, is that encounter design and adventure paths, from what I've seen, includes usually more straightforward combats that don't really require spells in order to solve. I do think this is a much smaller thing, and I don't really run adventure paths. I just read up on some and looked at some forums, some posts about it, some discussions, seen some videos that bring this up as a possible reason people might play martials over casters, so I wanted to acknowledge it here. Let's start with that first point though. As I mentioned in my Remaster Problem video, there were quite a few converts into Pathfinder 2nd Edition from D&D thanks to the OGL scandal over 2 years ago. I myself am one such convert. The players from DnD5E came to a system that was familiar in many ways, yet distinctly different in others. A major standout, especially when watching YouTube content creators or checking out Reddit posts, is they often mention how overpowered fighters are and how hard martials can hit in the system. This is exciting. This is an exciting part for the system, that martials and near martial characters, what they can do and what they can be capable of is much different. The 4 degrees of success, combined with the way that critical hit damage is calculated, is an obvious boost for martial characters in the system, makes them feel dangerous as damage dealers, and that's what they should be. It doesn't take long to realize that a fighter with a two-handed weapon, like a greatsword, might even have a 30% chance to crit at level 1 against certain enemies. They can just go around and destroy enemies, taking them out, dealing upwards of 50 damage right away. At the same time, martials are much easier to build and play in Pathfinder 2e for newcomers than spellcasters are, just because then you have to learn spells and to understand how spellcasting works in the system. Put all that together and you end up with a whole list of reasons that you might migrate towards martial characters rather than casters coming from DnD5e. Yes, you give up some of that versatility, I'd say a fair amount of it, but a lot of martial classes, thanks to the feats they take, still allow you some level of control or buff options that you can take with your feats for your class. While it is true that casters are not going to do the same single target damage as a martial will, at least not often, what they are best at, martials just can't really compare to. As I said, there are feats and actions, activities that allow martials to provide some level of support or control in the battlefield. However, they won't have the same level of control, support, and AoE damage that are available to spellcasters through spell slots and through focus spells. What's a good comparison? Well, a martial character can absolutely play a small healing role with the medicine skill and feats like battle medicine. This allows them to run up to a downed character and roll a medicine check to deal 2d8 hit points back with a single action, which is very cool. Then they can't use it against that character for a whole day, but still, it's a nice option to have for a martial. This is very useful, and I honestly highly recommend it for just about any character. But some spellcasters have access to the heal spell. This is a very useful, highly recommended spell that uses 1, 2, or 3 actions to change what the spell does that can heal one or even a whole group of targets in AoE around you. Let's use the 2-action version though for a comparison. For 2 actions, this will let the caster choose a target up to 30 feet away, and you heal them for 1d8 plus 8 healing. No check required, you just do this, and that's on average going to be higher than the 2d8 you would do. And in that case, yes, it's 1 action to use battle medicine, but you have to run up to them. So 2 actions is a pretty fair comparison. And every spell slot rank above first increases this healing by 1d8 plus 8, whereas battle medicine will never be able to keep up with that level of scaling. And of course, the versatility of the heal spell means for 3 actions, you can just AoE bomb a whole section of folks that get healed. And for 1 action, if that's all you want to spend on it, you can do a melee heal that's just not terribly strong, but at least still doesn't require a check. We have similar situations for control where demoralize as an action, used by anybody, but really good for martials, and the fear spell are similar in scope, at least for a level 1 fear, But there's versatility in the Fear spell that Demoralize simply doesn't have. And keep in mind that if we use a 3rd level spell slot or better for Fear, you're going to be able to target up to 5 creatures, which is kind of crazy. When we look at the two, Fear and Demoralize, you've got a pretty decent comparison, but Demoralize can only be used against the same creature once within 10 minutes, doesn't use a spell slot, and then, of course, they don't get a save against it, but your Demoralize probably isn't going to be using your highest level stat if you're a Marshal, whereas you're using your highest level stat as a Spellcaster to cast Fear. Fear is still going to be a better option and more versatile, especially as you increase in level. Then we have AoE damage. This is not generally a strong suit for Marshals, but there certainly are Marshals who can take certain feats that let them do AoE damage right around them, or even AoE damage in an area, say like a Dragon Barbarian with Dragon's Breath, or some of what an Inventor can do as a near Marshal with some of their abilities. It still doesn't hit the level of versatility of AoE options that casters have, and they usually don't keep up on damage with spell slot AoE damage spells. But those are some of the things that spellcasters are really meant to be good at in the system, so it makes sense that they're better than Marshals at it. And what they aren't as good at, which is things like single target damage or survivability, well, they're generally much worse at those things. There are still strong single target damage spells, don't get me wrong. I have a cleric in one of my games who loves single target damage, and he can rip through enemies, but most of the damage requires that enemies critically fail a saving throw, and that doesn't happen nearly as much as a Marshal can critically succeed at hitting an enemy. So yes, you can do a lot of damage either way, but you're more likely to pull off that high single target damage as a Marshal, which again is how it should be. And as far as survivability, we talked about survivability in DnD5e. You've got those broken spells like Shield. Well, this doesn't really have the same thing. Is there a Shield cantrip? Yes. Is it strong? It's good. Having a +1 AC for 1 action for the round is a good thing to have, but it's not broken like Shield is as a 1st level spell in DnD5e. This means that casters in Pathfinder 2nd Edition are often much squishier than Marshals, which again fits the system and is a fair trade-off. Now, of course, you can shore that up with some nice archetypes and feats, but by default, this is the separation we're looking at. As a caster in Pathfinder2e, it is unlikely you're going to want to stand up on the front line and take hits, with few exceptions. Speaking of that Shield spell and other overpowered spells in DnD5e, we don't have that same level of overpowered spell very often in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In PF2E, it's simply, you can't just end an encounter, usually, with a spell like you can in 5e. Let's take a comparison. We've got Hypnotic Pattern, which I talked about earlier in DnD5e. This has a fairly large area. It is a single save to incapacitate all creatures. If they fail, they're just going to stand there and do nothing round after round unless they're attacked or knocked out of it by somebody or you lose concentration. But generally speaking, you can take entire groups of enemies out of combat with that single cast at the 1st round of combat. The closest thing we have in Pathfinder 2nd Edition to that spell is called Hypnotize. This is also an AoE spell of the same level and does a similar size, but it only dazzles and fascinates at worst. If you want to understand those conditions, check out my condition video. It'll run through them for you. But the quick version is, well, at worst, you may have to make extra checks to target enemies, and probably not the biggest deal. You can just leave the area too, and then you won't be affected by it anymore. So this is not a shut down the entire encounter. This is affect an area and cause trouble for the enemies. These are very different in power for their level, and at level 3, you shouldn't be able to shut down an entire encounter with a single cast of a spell. Now granted, the Fear spell does have some pretty powerful abilities to it, but even that, the Frighten condition, if you do target 5 creatures with it at level 3, the Frighten condition is strong, but it's not going to take them out of combat. You just don't see that very often. The Hypnotize spell is far from the most exciting 3rd level spell in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but it is a good comparison and when correctly timed, can be fitting, and that's the whole point. Spells in Pathfinder 2nd Edition fit certain situations, certain scenarios, and that's the power of being a caster. In fact, while there are absolutely strong spells in Pathfinder 2e, I'm looking at you, Synesthesia, it's rare to find spells that feel flat out broken within the system at all. The strongest control spells in the game are given the incapacitation trait. Well, with the exception of some like Synesthesia, but generally they are, meaning that creatures of a higher level than you, when they make their save, they get 1 level greater than whatever they rolled. So if you have a boss monster and you use something like Banishment against it, it means that they get one level higher than their roll. So even if they critically failed their roll, they're just getting a failure, and the result is not nearly as punishing, because banishment can remove a creature from a combat. Yes, you can remove minions from a combat pretty easily if they're, a slightly lower level than you, but the chance of doing it to a boss monster, well, that's just being kind of removed from you. And boss monsters are going to have pretty decent saves, so the chance of them getting a crit fail in the beginning aren't great, but their failures suddenly become successes. Successes do have effects, though, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, where successes often don't in DnD5E. Still, these shutdown spells, these removal spells, aren't going to be combat winning in Pathfinder 2nd Edition the way they are combat winning in DnD5E. Because they're not as strong, yes, it makes these spellcasters not feel as powerful as they were in DnD5E, and they're not. And that's good. One curveball in the martial caster divide dialogue I have going here is the option to have limited spell casting on a martial character. I don't mean the way that a magus or summoner have limited spell slots, though you could look at that differently too. No, I mean that you can get access to spell casting through archetypes. Whether you use free archetype in the system, or you're just talking about picking up an archetype as one of your class feats to do that with, you can get access to spell casting. So let's look at the druid dedication just as an example. Okay, so you take your dedication as an archetype, and now you have some cantrips that you can cast. Not overly powerful, great. By level 4, maybe you have a focus spell, maybe you take spell casting and get a couple of, like first and second level spell slots. Okay. If you keep leaning heavily into that, though, by 20th level, you'll have an 8th level spell slot, a 7th level spell slot, and 2 from every level of 6th level spell slots all the way down to 1. Plus, you still have your cantrips. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to meet what a regular caster has, but, they have 10th level spells, you still have 8th level, and that's really strong. Also, you're going to have master proficiency with your spell casting, where, of course, a caster at this point has legendary, still master is strong. Keeping in mind that your strongest stat probably isn't whatever is the stat that you use for your spellcasting, unless you're like a partial martial, right? These half martials like inventors and things like that. But you do have a lot of power with your spellcasting, so that might feel like it steals from the full caster because you're doing so much that they have access to. But this is a little misleading, because let's go back a little bit. This is at 20th level I talked about. Not a lot of games are going that far. If we're talking about back down at like level 12, which is more around when things actually do end, your progression hasn't caught up much. The progression picks up real slow and then hits really hard later on. So at level 12, you don't have nearly the power that a 12th level caster does. So you're not going to overshadow them in most campaigns. If you get high level, you might start playing in their sandbox a little bit more. They'll still just have things that you can't do. For instance, as a 20th level druid, I can turn into a kaiju. Can your marshal turn into a kaiju with the dedication? No, they cannot. This last point, I admit I have less experience with. I decided to research encounters from various adventure paths because I want to do my research. I don't want to just say these things. With the adventures I looked at, there are a lot of combat encounters in those that really are very straightforward, meaning that you're there to destroy a lot of monsters, and it doesn't have a lot of verticality. It doesn't have a lot of options for using the environment in crazy ways. And part of that is because they want it to be accessible to any party. So if you have a full martial party, you don't need spells in order to solve the encounter. And that's good design. Don't get me wrong. I want it to be able to be handled by any group. But because of that, it may not feel like casters are necessary, or it lets them flex their muscles as much. Whereas if you're building your own game, and I think a lot of us do, I know I do, it looks like from the videos I watch, they tend to build a lot of their adventures. In those adventures, if you have a caster in your group, you can build encounters to help them take advantage of what makes them great. So yes, while the default adventure path might not force the use of spellcasters, if you have one in your group as a GM, there's a great opportunity to really let them show what they can do that marshals don't do as well. Because everybody in your group should get to show off what they're best at. I hope now you can see that I don't actually think there's a spellcaster martial divide problem in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In fact, I think the system has pretty solid balance and really solves that problem for people coming across from DnD5E. If you haven't considered a caster before, I would encourage you to take a look and play around with them. Learning the spellcasting really isn't that hard. I have a video on it, and playing around with the different spells we have. Once you get into certain spells and you find the ones you like, they can be a lot of fun and offer you a lot of versatility. Perhaps you'll find that psychics with their amped up cantrips are more your style, or you'll really like what the cleric has with its free healing options that it gets every day. While you go and do that though, I'm going to look at some high level spells because they're just fun, and as always, adventure on.